listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host, and what a busy week it's been all around. I yesterday had the pleasure to be on the podcast, a new podcast from Karen Sanders, and we had a lot of fun. And I hope that when it comes out, all of you lovely people are going to join in and have a listen. Essentially, it was a podcast that focused really on essentially what I've learnt in my over 40 years of being a psychologist, a psychotherapist, and someone who speaks and writes and so on. So hopefully it's going to come across as being interesting and somewhat entertaining. I keep things fairly light, so, I always want to put in some gems in terms of, you got to listen for them because they're embedded in there. They might not be highlighted, as it were, but, I want you to, take that time and listen to it. And at the end of the podcast, I'm going to give you a little bit of a blurb about Karen's new podcast. And, and later on in the next few podcasts, I'll give you the where you can listen to it. Okay, so we've been doing lots of stuff about ADD, ADHD. And so I've tried really to give an overview about the fundamentals and some of the issues that I see with this. And I'm going to continue because as a consumer, I think it's very, very important that we make informed choices and that, when we consent to treatment, it's actually informed consent rather than just, this looks like a pretty good idea, let's roll with it. Now, part of that is that we do need to trust our scientists and we do need to trust our clinicians and doctors and so on. But, my view is never put your brain on hold. It doesn't work very well when it's on hold. And unfortunately, a lot of people do that, whether that's in the political sphere, whether it's about education, science, whatever it is. We need to think more critically and to apply choices that are wise. A little meme came around my Facebook thing from David Attenborough, who I, have a total bromance with because I think this man is just incredible. He's not just a national treasure; he's a global treasure. And one of the things that he said was, and I'm paraphrasing, that human beings got to where we are through our intelligence. And that's how we survived. If we're going to continue to survive, we need to kick in wisdom. And I, some time ago, did a whole podcast on the whole relationship going from data through to wisdom and what we need to accumulate in between. And unfortunately, when I look around and I watch media and I look at social media to get a sense of, what's going on in the world, what are people picking up on, I've got to say it's often very, very disappointing with regard to what gets clicks. You can put up something very, very serious, and then if you put up someone who's like a Kardashian or who has very little clothing, that gets a bucket load more hits than anything of true value. So there's my rant for the morning. So let's continue with this thing about ADHD and focus. And one of the things I started doing in the last podcast was to critique some of the studies. And I know this is like people are going to go, oh, here we go, this is really boring. But actually it's not. I'm going to try to make it less boring than what you may anticipate. Because we do need to have a very critical mind. I mean, science reporting at times is fundamentally atrocious. They come up with all sorts of stuff. And, I'll give you an example. In the 70s and 80s, you couldn't eat potato, right? It was nutritionally bad, right? Well, that whole thing's been completely debunked. And there's a whole bunch of other things like that keep coming up. And, in the last podcast, I talked about, the advent of the Ozempic as managing, weight loss. And, more recently, we're getting a whole bunch of reports about might have been a little premature with actually going on board with that stuff because it does some nasty things to you. Right? So, having said that, we got to keep in mind that whenever we take on any intervention, it potentially is a lot of good, but we also got to take into account some of the downsides to that, okay? And that just doesn't go for medical, pharmaceutical interventions. It actually can be the case with psychological interventions, okay? One of the things that I often see is how people have been rushed through therapy through using, very deep experiential exercises that often have left the person very unsettled and in some cases disturbed and distressed. Now, I don't think that's a really good thing. Okay, let me get into, some of these critiques. Now, one of the significant challenges in ADHD research is the fact that we're dealing with a whole bunch of dissimilar sort of conditions. ADHD can present with various symptom profiles, including predominantly inattentive or predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, and combined presentations. Studies often group all types of these together, potentially masking essential differences. And again, one of my issues here is, are we creating something separate from what actually is potentially an anxiety disorder? And there are many different types of anxiety disorders. We have ego anxiety, symptom anxiety, performance anxiety, but they all have different profiles and they manifest quite differently from person to person. The other issue is that ADHD diagnostic criteria have evolved over the years. And this has an impact on research results, so it's not clean. Studies conducted using older criteria may not align with more recent studies. And so a lot of, medical, psychiatric, psychological studies methodologically have certain problems. We really selecting people for samples and control groups that we can be confident with are different enough, okay? So there's also the issue about what we call sample variability. So participant samples in ADHD research can vary widely, including age groups like children, adolescents, adults, gender ratios, clinical settings going from community to clinical to schools. And in my view, this variability affects the generalizability of findings. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's such a wide variety of stuff going on that we actually can't nail down what's truly going on and whether this applies across the board. I've got a special announcement about how you can work with me. Since starting this podcast, I've had a lot of inquiries from listeners asking how they can work with me on a one-to-one basis. Now, I've finally managed to free up some time to work with about 5 clients privately. Typically, we'll work together for 6 months applying the ideas I discuss here to help you lead a fulfilled, meaningful and happy life and a well-rounded life. If that's something you'd be interested in, drop me an email at gunter@goodmengreat.com and we'll be in touch. The other issue that we've got is medication effects. A lot of studies on ADHD include participants who are on medication. Now, one of the things a psychiatrist taught me who I trained with was that we were working in as interns in, or he was the director of the service, I was the intern, was that when a patient was admitted into the inpatient unit, sometimes it was really, really useful just to take them off all medication and to see what emerges, what sort of symptom profile comes together when they're not on meds. And I always remember that because I felt that was actually a really useful approach, because medication can have all sorts of different impacts on a person's presentation, personality. For example, in schizophrenia, when someone's had schizophrenia for a long, long time, they sort of, and they used to refer to that as, burnout. The person would present like almost a shell, like autistic in some way, being on the spectrum. But they're not on the spectrum. They're actually experiencing the burnout of their mental illness. And so there are very specific things to look for in that context. The other issue about this is that while it's necessary to understand the effects of treatment, it really does have confounding results. And medications are supposed to alter brain structure and function. Although whether it does impact on structure, it does is a question, but it does impact on function. So we really need to be very, very careful with that. The other one is a thing called comorbidity. In my experience, and especially over the recent 20 years, most people present to me not with one diagnosis, but with many, especially teenagers, oppositional disorders, all sorts of stuff, learning disabilities. We have a host, right? So people present with mood disorders and conduct problems. And again, specifically, this refers to teenagers. All sorts of stuff's going on, right? So when we look at, what is the person presenting with, these days it's very rare that it's just one particular diagnosis. The other issue in the research are things like longitudinal versus cross-sectional studies. And what that basically means, longitudinal studies are over the long term, okay? So you might be going 20 years. Cross-sectional studies can't capture that sort of information over time because it's short term. And so we have some issues about understanding the development and course of what we refer to as ADHD. So another thing that's come up recently, and it was particularly relevant to a newspaper article about the prevalence of ADHD in a population and the prescription statistics, sometimes don't appear to fit together. They're incongruent. Now, the reason for that, and there's a number of reasons. So let me start off with the first one, underdiagnosis and undertreatment. Now, we've got to be careful here because the question that I think we need to be asking, are we overdiagnosing? Are we overtreating? We can't just go, we're underdiagnosing and undertreating. We need to ask both sides of the coin. So many individuals with ADHD don't receive a formal diagnosis or treatment. They often, because of a lack of awareness, a stigma, or the belief that it's a childhood thing, don't actually get identified. And maybe that's a clue. Maybe they, in fact, don't necessarily need to be identified. Not everything needs treatment, although these days we would like to include everything. So I've spoken about underdiagnosis and undertreatment, and overdiagnosis and overmedication, right? So we just need to be very careful with those two. The other variation in this whole picture is diagnostic practices. And they vary largely between clinician and regions. So some clinicians may be more conservative in diagnosing ADHD, while other people may have a much lower threshold. And I think this is where we also get into an important area of observer biases, cognitive biases. And I could talk about that in a lot more detail, but in this particular episode, this particular podcast, I don't want to get into it, but I just want to flag it that there's a whole bunch of biases that scientists and clinicians bring to the studies and practice that have an influence on outcome. Okay? The other thing that's been important to take into consideration is that there's been changes in diagnostic trends. So that might be stuff about beliefs, attitudes, opinions. It can be about collecting information differently. It can be about what we put a person through in the process of diagnosis. There is a lot of stuff that is connected to neurodevelopment, neuroscience, that a particular neuroscientist whose name right now escapes me labels neurotrash. One of those, I'll give you an example, is that male brains are fundamentally structurally different to female brains. Not true, it's myth. Fundamentally, the only difference might be in size because men tend to be bigger than women. That's it. The rest of it's, as she puts it, neurotrash. Another variable that impacts here is the access to healthcare. And so when people don't have the resources or the education, they will leave things. I get that often with men, and obviously also one of the things that impacts there is beliefs and attitudes. Right? A lot of times men, will have a complaint, or they're in distress, or they might be suffering a psychological disorder, but they stubbornly refuse to get treatment. So there are a number of issues that influence this whole thing. And so what we really need to do, and this is, I'm going to do this in the next podcast, is actually to look at there are three, in my view, key models in approaching, the whole psychological disorder sort of landscape spectrum. And I think we need to begin to be very critical about this, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been now pathologized where I go, well, that's actually more about being human than it is having a pathology, that it's got to be treated. Lots of things, can be distressing, but they don't necessarily need treatment. What they might need is a community support, a peer support process, right? That's how we can more effectively intervene. I think one of the challenges, especially with children and teenagers, is that rearing children and teenagers has become the responsibility fundamentally of two people, one of whom often isn't necessarily available. And in a lot of cases, two people aren't really available to that child or those children. And, I'm a very firm believer that, it takes a village to raise kids. I think we need to have a much more comprehensive perspective about what it takes to create adults and bring them through childhood and adolescence where they have the opportunity to develop characters that are virtuous and ethical and socially connected and emotionally responsible and ultimately mature and wise. it's a big job for one or two people who are really preoccupied with, in most cases in our society, with, earning a living. And even if you've got masses of money, a lot of times getting that massive amount of money requires you to be away from the primary role of the parent. And I think that's very sad, and I think it's reflected not only in children and adolescents' mental health statistics, but also in adults. Why is it that as men, our mental health statistics are shocking, right? When we live in a society that's been wealthier than ever before, where physically we can actually live a lot longer because we've got the technology, the pharmaceuticals to do that, but yet it ain't happening. All right, I hope you found that interesting. Please, if you want to make any comments or so on, get in touch with me. You know the spiel. I'm on the internet, so you can just Google me. My website is www.goodmengreat.com or www.gunterswoboda.com. And please, if you enjoy my work, if you enjoy how I comment on things in the sphere of psychology, in the social sciences, and occasionally politics, I'm really itching to get into that sucker. But maybe that's for a later time. Stay tuned next time. I'm going to talk about the work of Gabor Mate, and I'm going to take some of the work of Augusto Fuentes and sort of shine the ADHD light through that framework as well, and then talk a bit about the medical framework as well, and what some of the issues are there, and how we can broaden this out. Until next time, please focus on changing whatever it is that doesn't work in your life and inspire others, because if you do that, that's exactly what's going to happen. Until next time, this is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.